Hey, boys and girls, it's time for Chapter 3 of Because of Winn Dixie. If you haven't had a chance to listen to Chapters 1 and 2 with Miss Lori from yesterday, you might want to go back into your Google Classroom and listen to that before you continue on with me. But in the meantime, as I recall, if you're staying on with me, you might remember that Winn Dixie was getting himself into a whole lot of trouble, and Opal was finding herself a new friend. I started in on Winn Dixie right away, trying to clean him up. First, I gave him a bath, and I used the garden hose and some baby shampoo. He stood still for it, but I could tell he didn't like it. He looked insulted, and the whole time he didn't show me his teeth or wag his tail once. After he was all washed and dried, I brushed him good, and I used my own hairbrush, and I worked real hard at all the knots and patches of fur stuck together. He didn't mind being brushed. He wiggled his back like it felt pretty good. The whole time I was working on him, I was talking to him, and he listened. And I told him how we were alike. You see, you don't have any family, and neither do I. I've got the preacher, of course, but I don't have a mama. I have one, but I don't know where she is. She left when I was 3 years old. I can hardly remember her, and I'll bet you don't remember your mama much either. So it's kind of like we're orphans. Winn Dixie looked straight at me when I said that to him, like he was feeling relieved to finally have someone who understand his situation. I nodded my head at him and went on talking. I don't even have friends because I had to leave them all behind when we moved here from Watley. Watley's up in North Florida. Have you ever been to North Florida? Winn Dixie looked down at the ground like he was trying to remember if he had. You know what? I said. Ever since we moved here, I've been thinking about my mama extra hard, more than I ever did when we were in Watley. Winn Dixie twitched his ears and raised his eyebrows. I think the preacher thinks about my mama all the time, too. He's still in love with her. I know that because I heard the ladies at the church in Watley talking about him. They said he's still hoping she'll come back, but he doesn't tell me that. He won't talk to me about her at all, and I want to know more about her. I'm afraid to ask the preacher. I'm afraid he'll get mad at me. Winn Dixie looked at me hard, like he was trying to say something. What? I said. He stared at me. You think I should make the preacher tell me about her? Winn Dixie looked so hard at me, he sneezed. I'll think about it, I said. And when I was done working on him, Winn Dixie looked a whole lot better. He still had his bald spots, but the fur that he did have cleaned up nice. It was all shiny and soft. You could still see his ribs, but I intended to feed him good, and that would take care of that. I couldn't do anything about his crooked yellow teeth because he always got to sneezing every time that I started brushing them with my toothbrush, and I finally had to give up. But for the most part, he looked a whole lot better, and I took him to the trailer, and I showed him to the preacher. Daddy, I said. He said. He was working on a sermon and kind of muttering to himself. Daddy, I want to show you the new Winn Dixie. And the preacher put down his pencil and rubbed his nose, and finally he looked up. Well, he said, smiling real big at Winn Dixie, well now, don't you look handsome? Winn Dixie smiled back at the preacher. He went over and put his head in the preacher's lap. He smells nice, too, said the preacher, and he rubbed Winn Dixie's head and looked into his eyes. Daddy, I said real quick before I lost all my nerve, I've been talking to Winn Dixie. Is that right? The preacher said, and he scratched Winn Dixie's head. I've been talking to him, and he agreed with me that since I'm 10 years old, you should tell me 10 things about my mama, just 10 things, that's all. The preacher stopped rubbing Winn Dixie's head and held real still. I could see him thinking about pulling his head back into his old shell. One thing for each year I've been alive, I told him, please. Winn Dixie looked up at the preacher and kind of gave him a nudge with his nose. The preacher sighed, and he said to Winn Dixie, I guess I should have known that you were going to be some kind of trouble. And then he looked at me. Come on, Opal, he said, sit down, and I'll tell you 10 things about your mama. 1, said the preacher. We were sitting on the couch, and Winn Dixie was sitting between us. Winn Dixie had already decided that she liked the couch a lot. 1, said the preacher. Winn Dixie looked at him straight and hard. Your mama was funny. She could make just about anybody laugh. 2, he said. She had red hair and freckles. Just like me, I said. Just like you, the preacher nodded. 3, she liked to plant things. She had a talent for it. She could stick a tire in the ground and grow a car. Winn Dixie started chewing on his paw, but I tapped him on the head to make him stop. 4, said the preacher. She could run fast. If you were racing with her, you couldn't ever let her get a head start because she would beat you for sure. Oh, I'm like that too, I said. Back home in Watley, I raced against Liam Fullerton, and I beat him, and he said it wasn't fair because boys and girls shouldn't race each other to begin with, and I told him he was just a sore loser. The preacher nodded, and he was quiet for a minute. I'm ready for number 5, I told him. 5, she couldn't cook. She burned everything, including water. She had a hard time opening a can of beans. She couldn't make head nor tails of a piece of meat. 6, and the preacher rubbed his nose and looked at the ceiling, and Winn Dixie looked up too. Number 6 is that your mama loved a story. She would sit and listen to stories all day long. She loved to be told a story. She especially liked funny ones, stories that made her laugh. The preacher nodded his head like he was agreeing with himself. What's number 7, I asked. Let's see, he said. Well, she knew all of the constellations, every planet in the nighttime sky, every last one of them. She could name them and point them out. She never, ever got tired of looking up at them. Number 8, said the preacher with his eyes closed, was that she hated being a preacher's wife. She said that she just couldn't stand having the ladies at church judge what she was wearing and what she was cooking and how she was singing. She said it made her feel like a bug under a microscope. Winn Dixie lay down on the couch. He put his nose in the preacher's lap and the tail in mine. 10, said the preacher. 9, I told him. 9, said the preacher. Sometimes she and I just had to fight a little bit. Number 10 is that your mama loved you. She loved you very, very much. But she left me, I told him. She left us, said the preacher softly, and I could see him pulling his old turtle head back up into his stupid turtle shell. She packed her bags and left us. Okay, I said as I got up off the couch. Winn Dixie hopped off too. Thank you for telling me, I said. And I went right back to my room and I wrote down all 10 things the preacher had told me. I wrote them down just the way he said them to me so that I wouldn't forget them. And then I read them out loud to Winn Dixie until I had them memorized. I wanted to know those 10 things inside and out. That way, if my mama ever came back, I could recognize her, and I would be able to grab her and hold on to her tight and never let her get away from me again. I hope you enjoyed chapters 3 and 4 and that you're looking forward to hearing from Miss Core when she reads chapters 5 and 6 tomorrow. We miss you guys and are so glad we can share this time with you. Have a great afternoon.